everyone. My name is Nick Mia, and my presentation today is titled Gods and Monsters, the monster constructions of the transgender woman. So, today I'll be exploring in this video how society often casts trans women into the role of quote unquote the monster and the very real harmful consequences of this. So, just as an introduction, with gods, monsters, and anxieties throughout history, cultures have used the figures of gods and monsters very often. So monsters often represent what society fears, the unknown, it's different, and it helps to define the boundaries of what's considered quote unquote normal. Gods, on the other hand, often embody societal ideas, but these lines very often blur. And my argument today is that in our contemporary world, transgender women are actively and harmfully being constructed as monstrous figures. This isn't accidental. I think it serves to justify discrimination, uphold rigid patriarchal gender binaries, and sadly leads to a lot of real harm and violence as well. So, um, to begin, with the monster framework. So, how does this, quote unquote, monster making happen? It often starts with defining who counts as human. Western culture frequently relies on a cis normative standard, assuming alignment between assigned sex of birth and gender identity as the default or quote unquote natural way to be. Anything deviating from this can be framed as unnatural and other. So the monster theorist Jeffrey Jerome Cohen, which we talked a lot about this semester, talks about how these monsters exist, quote, at the gates of difference, and quote, marking the edges of the accepted world. They become cultural bodies onto which we project collective anxieties and desires, and that framework is going to be useful as we continue, to examine this monstrous construction of the trans woman. So this trans woman is a very, very active archetype for this monstrous other. Trans women, by their very existence, challenge the rigid binary understanding of gender that is deeply embedded in these patriarchal structures that we live in. Because they transgress these expected norms, they're often framed as unnatural, artificial, or even deceptive, essentially positioned outside the accepted definition of woman or even human. These intersects with misogyny in a specific way, in a way that Julia Serrano calls transmisogyny in her book Whipping Girl, which targets and devalues trans femininity specifically. And these psychological projections and fear, psychologically, monsters often embody these things that society represses or fears. Anxieties about the fluidity of gender, the stability of personal identity, or non-normative sexualities get projected onto trans women. We see harmful tropes portraying them as inherently deceptive or predatory. Think of the ancient succubus myth that was repurposed. These strips them of their humanity and reduces them to caricatures. Cohen also notes the monster, quote, always returns and feels relevant to the persistent societal panic and the alarming rise in anti-trans legislation we see today, nationwide and also worldwide. These fears keep resurfacing. And in the mythic parallels, in power and chaos, interestingly, if you look at ancient myths like Hesiod's Theogony or the Babylonian Enuma Elish, gods and monsters weren't always strict opposites. They often came with the same primordial chaos and held immense power, both creative and destructive. Figures like Tiamat become monster symbols of chaos that needed to be defeated for order to arise. Trans women, by challenging this gender binary, can trigger what Cohen calls a category crisis. They disrupt the fundamental organizing principle, and this disruption is perceived by some as dangerous, chaotic, monstrous. The violent efforts to suppress trans existence tragically echo those ancient mythic battles aimed at imposing order over perceived chaos. And politically, what does this political dimension tells us about this monster politic? This construction also has a powerful political dimension. Think of Thomas Hobbes' Leviathan. The monstrous state needed to impose order. Modern state and political actors often identify marginalized groups as internal threats to justify control. Trans people, especially trans women, are increasingly framed this way as dangers to children, societal values, or the nation. This rhetoric fuels discriminatory laws restricting healthcare, public participation, and legal recognition. It's a contemporary monster politic, using state power to define and neutralize a group constructed as a threat. And this has real world consequences of violence and discrimination. This isn't just theoretical. These concepts actually have real world harm. This monster's construction has devastating real world consequences. Data from groups like where I work at the Advocates for Trans Equality tragically document hundreds of deaths of trans and gender diverse people globally each year due to violence, with trans women of color being disproportionately affected. Furthermore, surveys produced like the U.S. Trans Survey in 2015 by NCTE consistently show staggering rates of poverty, unemployment, homelessness, harassments, and barriers to essential healthcare, all stemming from pervasive discrimination fueled by this dehumanizing, monstrous narrative. So this is the why it's important to speak about the importance of recognition. Central to this concept of recognition, as thinkers like Moya Riley and Tyler Mel Bechter discuss, when society refuses to recognize trans women as women, it denies their personhood and subjectivity. This lack of recognition, often fueled by trans misogynistic ideas about who counts as a woman, pays for the dehumanization and mistreatment of all women. They are positioned as outsiders, aberrations, making them vulnerable for the state or for other malicious actors to define what is a woman and police it as such, often through violent ends. So, in conclusion, to dismantle this monster, the construction of trans women is a complex issue rooted in cultural narratives, psychological fears, political power plays, and historical marginalization. It draws on ancient powers of dealing with the other, but has intensely harmful contemporary impact, as statistics on violence and discrimination show. Understanding this process is vital. Dismantling this monstrous narrative requires us to actively challenge rigid gender binaries, confront our collective societal fears, and, most importantly, affirm the full humanity, dignity, and right to recognition of all transgender people. Thank you.